Hi, my name is Alex Dolphin, and welcome back to another episode of Ex Ante. Today we're going to discuss the case United States versus Salerno. This case started in the Supreme Court of the United States in the year 1987. Let's go ahead and jump into the facts of the case. So Mr. Salerno was basically the boss of the Genovese crime family. You might think of this family as an old school family from The Godfather. A mob family, a mob boss is essentially what Mr. Salerno is. He's arrested and charged with violations of RICO, which was an act that was passed by Congress that basically was going after people that were running gangs or criminal organizations. And so it's a federal criminal law. So Mr. Salerno is arrested of this, and he's seeking pretrial release. So he's trying to say, hey, let me get out until the trial. Like, let me pay bail and let me get out until the trial. Unfortunately for Mr. Salerno, Congress passed this act in 1984 called the Bail Reform Act. What this act did was it gave the courts the ability to deny bail to someone if the state presented clear and convincing evidence that no conditions reasonably assure the safety of the community. So that's saying if the state can prove very clearly that a defendant is going to pose a safety threat to the community, well, then the state can just flat out deny bail. Mr. Salerno obviously is displeased with this, but he fights it in a hearing, and eventually, he's denied his bail. He appeals to the Second Circuit, and the Second Circuit says this law that Congress passed, the Bail Reform Act of 1984, is unconstitutional on its face. Because it violates the Fifth Amendment. It's depriving a person of liberty without due process of law. More specifically, substantive due process is where the court found the violation. So the state is obviously displeased with this, and so they appeal to the Supreme Court of the United States. The Supreme Court is presented with the question of whether the Bail Reform Act violates the Fifth Amendment and or the Eighth Amendment. And the majority, in a 6-3 opinion written by Justice Rehnquist, pretty clearly says no. This does not violate the Constitution. Congress's Bail Reform Act of 1984 is constitutional. This is fine. Courts can deny bail to certain individuals if they're a severe threat to the community. So what's the reasoning? The court first says that the Fifth Amendment, which guarantees life, liberty, and property, will not be deprived without due process of law, is not violated. The court dives into substantive due process and essentially says that this has to either shock the conscience or not comport with traditional notions of liberty in our society. The court ultimately says that this doesn't. The first and most important move that the court makes is it says this isn't punishment. Pretrial detention is not punishment, rather it's regulatory. And Congress made clear with its intent when it passed this statute that it was trying to portray a regulatory role. This act is meant to regulate community safety. It's not meant to punish people before guilt has been found by a court of law or a jury. And so the court says there can't really be a violation of the Fifth Amendment because this is regulatory. This isn't punitive. The people who are being denied bail aren't being punished. Rather, this law is being utilized to protect the community from severely dangerous individuals. Court highlights that there is procedural due process, and this law certainly comports with that in the sense that there is an evidentiary hearing at the bail hearing where each side can present witnesses and can put on a full case if they'd like to, where they can argue whether or not the person ought to be released. In this case, that happened. Ultimately, the court found that, hey, this guy is going to go back out. He's a mob boss. He will continue his criminal enterprise. It's his job, so we can't let him out. So the Fifth Amendment, the court says, is not violated here. The Eighth Amendment, the court also says, is not violated. The Eighth Amendment says that no excessive bail shall be required. So the court says no excessive bail shall be required doesn't mean that bail is necessarily allowed. It's kind of a tap dance sideswipe move that's done here by the majority. Essentially, they're saying if we're worried about a flight risk, if the defendant is going to be a flight risk, well, then we have to allow some type of bail, and it has to be reasonable. Can't be excessive, right? But if you're trying to make sure that someone is contained so that there isn't a safety risk to society, well, then we don't have to require bail. So the excessive bail really is only going towards the flight risk, is what the majority says here. If you're wondering if that's in the text of the Constitution, it's not very clear that it is. That's the reasoning that the court is reading into it. They're also looking at, the history of society, along with, our government has detained certain people without bail in many instances, like in war, when juveniles have been detained, sex offenders and real scary people, essentially, or a severe threat to society. We have detained them without bail. The court says that is fine. So here, this is also going to be fine as well. So that's the move on the Eighth Amendment. Justice Marshall writes a dissent, and he's one of the three that dissent. Justice Marshall says that basically the majority's opinion is sophistry, essentially, is what he says. First, he says the Fifth Amendment, this does not comport with the Fifth Amendment, this act, because you are locking away someone, you're taking away their liberty, and yeah, you're going to say it's regulatory. The court construes, ex post, saying that, hey, yeah, Congress meant this to be regulatory, so it's regulatory. But ultimately, who's it regulatory to? It's punitive to the person that's being punished. That person is absolutely being deprived of their liberty without a trial. And you're basically reading the Fifth Amendment backwards, is what Justice Marshall is getting across in his opinion, saying that if the Fifth Amendment means anything, it means that you will not be deprived of your liberty until you've been proven guilty. So where does he go with the Eighth Amendment then? He says the Eighth Amendment is basically works in tandem with the Fifth Amendment. And those two needed to be reasoned together rather than separate, which is what the majority does. Is it separates those two. Well, it says, you're protected by liberty, and the Eighth Amendment is also protection upon that, saying that, yeah, you will have freedom until you're actually convicted, and there won't be excessive bail, meaning that you will be able to go and live your life, essentially, until you're convicted by a court of law. And he says that essentially the Eighth Amendment analysis that the court does, this distinction between flight and safety is completely atextual. He is grabbing onto the text of the Eighth Amendment, saying that if no excessive bail can be set, well, we should read that to mean that that's the upper boundary, not that no bail could be set. No excessive bail seems to imply that bail should be allowed in every single case, and not that it can't be excessive, rather than bail could be denied in certain cases. And this distinction that he says between a flight risk and protecting safety that the court reads into the Eighth Amendment really just isn't there. And so it's really just an atextual opinion and an atextual reading of the Eighth Amendment along with the Fifth Amendment. And so it's an interesting case in where you see basically the liberal justices grabbing onto the text of the Constitution a little bit more clearly than the conservative bloc here. This is an interesting case. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you found it helpful. If you'd like to see more, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And I hope you have a nice rest of your day. Bye-bye.